Now we're looking at equations to determine whether or not those are functions. And as a reminder, an equation is another way of looking at a set of ordered pairs. An equation is actually a collection of ordered pair solutions to the equation itself. So here we have an example, and we're wanting to determine whether or not these are equations that are also functions. So we want to consider all of the ordered pair solutions to these equations. Now, infinitely many ordered pair solutions is of course impossible to look at, but the way that we can determine whether or not each x value determines only one y value output is by just plugging in several x values and seeing what happens and try to notice the pattern. So we'll start with plugging in random x values. These x values are chosen at random. They are x is equal to 0, so let's plug 0 in and see if we feel like one output is going to come out or potentially more than one output. Well, if I plug in x is equal to 0, I'm going to get y is equal to 1, and I'm not getting more than one output there, right? If I plug in x is equal to 1, I'm similarly just going to get one y value output. And when our equation is solved for y, then we can more easily see that what happens when I plug in an x is that I'm only going to get one y value as an output.
So this equation is a function.
So let's look at another example here. This one is actually not solved for y, but that is the first thing that we want to do. When the equation is solved for y, it's more easily to determine whether or not each x value input is going to generate one y or potentially more than one y value. So the first thing let's do is solve it for y by moving the x squared terms to the other side. So we have y squared is equal to 4 minus x squared, and then to solve for y, we'll take the square root of both sides. Now, anytime we take the square root of both sides of an equation, that comes along with the plus or minus on that radical, and so we end up with the square root of y squared, which is just y on the left, but we have plus or minus 4 minus x squared on the right. And so now when we go about finding the table of values or a collection of ordered pair solutions, certainly not all of them, but just enough to get an idea for what's happening here or the pattern. So let's plug in x is equal to 0, and we see that when we do that, we're going to get 4 minus 0, which is plus or minus square root 4, which is plus or minus 2. So we get not only a positive 2 output, but also a negative 2 output. And that's actually enough for me to see that the input 0 is going to generate two different outputs, and that's going to violate the definition of a function, and so this one is not a function. So again, we want to have our equation solved for y in order to get a table of values to see whether or not each x value is generating more than one y value. Now, here we have a radical again, but this time it's only the negative radical. We don't have a plus or minus like we did in the previous example. So when I go about putting in random x values, now these are all x values that are going to generate real outputs, right? So we want to plug in something that actually generates an output. We'll say when x is equal to 0, we're going to get not plus or minus, but just the minus rad 4, which is going to be negative 2. So in this case, x is equal to 0 only generates negative 2, and as a matter of fact, any of the x values that I plug in are only going to generate one y value. So even if I were to plug in x is equal to 1, I'll get negative rad 5 as an output, and we're not getting two separate outputs, we're only getting one output. And we can see that this pattern is going to continue because of the fact that we have just the minus, not a plus or minus radical here. And so this one is going to be, yes, a function. So we solve for y and plug in a couple of x values that generate real outputs to see whether the x values are generating one y or perhaps more than one y. If each x value input generates only one output, it's a function. If each x value generates potentially more than one output, we would say it's not a function.